I was standing at the edge of the tasting room in downtown Denver, staring at 18 perfect place settings, while Derek smiled too hard at women who had already seen him fail once. Cassie stood beside him with one hand wrapped around a water glass, close enough to look claimed, but far enough to pretend she was only there for the event. June slipped a folded timeline into my palm, and the weight of that single sheet felt steadier than my wedding band had in months. Across the room, Felicity Porter lifted her eyes from the table, not surprised to see me there, not flustered either, just quiet in the way powerful people get when they already know. Derek caught my face a second later, and I watched his mouth keep moving for half a beat after the confidence behind it had already broken. When I stepped closer, the room did not go silent all at once, but it thinned around me fast enough that even Cassie lowered her chin. I looked straight at Derek and said, "I did not walk out on dinner. I walked out on the moment you both decided I was easier to use than respect." Nobody rushed in to smooth it over, because June had already typed out the arrival times, the guest count, the empty kitchen, and the speaker call. Cassie shifted beside him then, just enough for me to catch the flicker in her face, and that tiny movement told the truth before either of them opened their mouths. At 2:52 that afternoon on March 8, my phone had lit up on the kitchen island with Derek's message telling me 18 women were coming by 7. The second message came right after, tighter and uglier because it sounded polished, with short rib for Felicity, seedless tart for Alana, and a note that Cassie had already organized preferences. I read those lines twice in my own kitchen and understood, before any guest arrived and before a single chair stayed empty, that I had not been invited into a dinner at all. By March of that year, Derek had trained our marriage into something that looked polished from outside and ran on assumptions from inside. And the ugliest part was how ordinary he made it feel. I worked all day with image archives, timestamps, and preservation records, so I noticed patterns for a living. But inside my own home, I had gotten used to being one. When people asked what made us work, he would smile with that easy published warmth and say, "Willa keeps everything seamless." And I used to hear gratitude where there was really assignment. At 2:52, his first text landed on the kitchen island while I was rinsing a coffee mug, and the second followed before I had even dried my hand enough to answer. 18 women by 7. Short rib for Felicity. Seedless tart for Alana. And Cassie had already organized dietary notes, which meant the evening had been built down to the last preference without me. I stood there reading her name inside my husband's instructions on International Women's Day, and that detail made the whole thing feel colder than if he had simply barked an order. Derek did not write like a husband checking in with his wife, and that was obvious before I even opened the calendar entry sitting in our shared account under home dinner test. That title told me the loft was not our home that night in his mind, just a polished environment for a trial run, and I was supposed to be the invisible labor inside it. When I opened the note attached to the event and saw initials in the corner, C. L, with plating reminders, guest flow, and timing marks, I stopped pretending Cassie was incidental. Cassie was not wandering into the edge of my life by accident, and the proof sat right there in bullet points she had typed, all of them based on my kitchen. She knew the guest count. She knew the menu. She knew what kind of women Derek wanted to impress. And she knew there was already a wife in that loft expected to carry the weight. I did not need a confession after that because the evidence had already done what confessions rarely do, which was tell the truth without asking for sympathy. So I answered Derek with one word. Okay, because anything longer would have warned him that I had seen the structure instead of the surface. Then I opened a booking site, found 4 nights in Glenwood Springs, paid for the room myself, and packed a small bag without once checking whether he deserved explanation. By the time I zipped the suitcase shut and looked back at the clean counters, I understood exactly what they had planned for me that night, and I knew I was not staying to perform it. By the time the car climbed west out of Denver, I had turned my phone face down in my lap and stopped checking whether Derek had learned anything yet. Glenwood Springs felt enough to loosen my chest. And when I reached the lodge, carried my bag inside, and heard nothing waiting for me, the silence settled into my body before my thoughts did. I changed, went downstairs, and ate a dinner I had not planned, timed, plated, or defended. And the fact of being served without explanation steadied me. Across the city, June Carver was looking out from her building at the first women arriving beneath the lights of our loft. She told me later the windows looked beautiful from the street, which made the truth hit harder once the elevator doors opened, and those women walked into a room with no smell of food. Derek met them with the kind of smile that only works when someone else has done the labor. And that smile started to slip before the second bottle of wine hit the counter. June said they came in expecting a tasting night, then slowed almost together when they saw the kitchen. The range was cold, the counters were bare, and the island held nothing but a bowl of lemons. So when Derek laughed and said Willa must be doing a final run, the room had answered him. What humiliated him was not my absence, but the spotless proof that he had built an evening on work he never bothered to confirm. I did not know any of that until the next morning, when I stood by the lodge window with June's voicemail playing through my phone. Her voice moved the way court reporters move, calm and exact, giving me arrival times, guest count. The moment Derek started walking room to room calling my name, and the minute one woman stepped back toward the elevator because she understood too fast, I stayed still while she spoke. And because she named the clean kitchen first, I knew the collapse had begun the second those women saw how I had been taken for granted. Then a text came through from a number I did not know, and when I opened it, Alana wrote that she was sorry because she had not realized the evening had been arranged that way. Before I could answer, June's second voicemail came in lower and sharper, telling me Derek had moved into the hallway to make calls once the panic started. And Cassie's voice had come through speaker with, "Did she freeze on you?" That sentence landed harder than the empty stove, because it proved Cassie had expected my labor, planned around it, and had a story ready for my refusal. I sat at the small desk in my lodge room with June's voicemails saved, Alana's text starred, and Derek's messages lined up in a row that looked uglier the longer I stared. My work had trained me to think in dates, sources, and clean chains. So once Cassie's hallway question was sitting there in black and white, my hands stopped shaking. I opened a fresh folder on my laptop, named it March 8, and started building the kind of record nobody could sweet-talk into sounding accidental. First went Derek's 2 texts with the guest count and menu instructions. Then the shared calendar entry labeled home dinner test. Then the event note carrying Cassie's initials. After that, I saved screenshots of the ride receipt out of Denver, my lodge confirmation, the exact timestamps on June's calls, and Alana's apology about not realizing how the evening had been arranged. I was not collecting feelings anymore, because those files had already drawn a cleaner picture than either of them ever would. Once everything was backed up, I called Ivy Dalton, who had been my friend before she became the person I trusted most with ugly paperwork. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished reading Cassie's line out loud, she let one beat pass and said, "Good. Now, stop explaining and start preserving." I could hear the legal brain click into place on the other end. Not cold, exactly. Just disciplined in a way that made panic feel childish. Ivy told me to send every screenshot, every voicemail, every booking receipt, and every charge touching that dinner, then not reply to Derek until the record was complete. She also told me not to argue by text, not to correct his version in real time, and not to give him advance warning if money had already started moving. Her reasoning was simple and hard to miss. Because Cassie's note proved planning, the calendar title proved purpose, and the guest messages proved the lie collapsed in public without any help from me. So I pulled our joint card statements and started reading line by line until a pattern surfaced where marriage used to be. There were rentals for stemware, linen deposits, test kitchen purchases, and a payment trail to Cassie that did not look romantic at all, which made it worse. What sat there in those charges was not one bad dinner, but the skeleton of a side venture being built with my home, my labor, and money neither of them had bothered to name honestly. I sent Ivy the statements, and less than 10 minutes later she called back with her voice sharpened into strategy. She said Colorado gave us order if we used it right. File first. Lock preservation first. Disclosures next. And let the court's automatic restraints do the work of stopping a disappearing act before it started. Hearing that while the folder grew heavier on my screen changed something in me. Because peace stopped sounding like forgiveness and started sounding like structure. That afternoon I took my phone down to the mineral pool, left it on silent beside a folded towel, and watched steam lift off the water while messages stacked without me. The quiet felt different now that the evidence had shape. Because the texts, the note, the charges, and June's exact timeline had already given my anger a frame strong enough to stand upright. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge and I went back upstairs, I was no longer deciding whether to return to Denver and talk, but exactly how I would return with a record neither Derek nor Cassie could bend. 3 days after I got back to Denver, Felicity texted that Derek was showing up at a women's enterprise fund tasting downtown with Cassie beside him, trying to reset the room before gossip hardened into judgment. I read that message twice at my kitchen counter, then opened the folder Ivy had helped me build. Because there was no point walking into a second table unless I carried the first one with me. By the time I left my apartment, I had printed the timeline, the calendar entry, the note with Cassie's initials, and the statements that turned their polished evening into a business plan funded inside my marriage. The room was bright in the careful way donor spaces always are. White linens, low flowers, stemware catching light, everything arranged to flatter money without insulting it. Derek was near the center, speaking with the smooth warmth he used when he thought image could outrun memory. And Cassie stood at his shoulder with the same professional half-smile she had worn in the note she drafted for my kitchen. I felt the full circle before either of them saw me, because the table in front of them was exactly the kind of scene they had wanted from my loft. Only this time I had brought the missing part with me. Felicity looked up first and did not flinch, which steadied me more than comfort would have, and June gave one small nod from the edge of the room where she had already chosen her place. Derek turned a second later, and I watched his expression split between annoyance and calculation before he landed on a public smile and tried. Willa, I wish you had called. I kept walking until there was no room left for distance to help him, then answered. You had my number on March 8 when you texted me 18 guests and Cassie's menu notes like I was labor you had already booked. That line changed the air immediately, because several women in that room had either been at my loft or heard enough to know I was not inventing anything new. Derek tried to laugh through it and said this was not the place, but June had already unfolded her typed timeline, and Alana had started moving closer before he finished. I held up the calendar entry first and said the place was chosen by him when he labeled my home a dinner test. Then I lifted Cassie's note and read the initials aloud before anyone could pretend she had just wandered in. Cassie stepped forward then and tried to soften herself into logistics, murmuring that she had only helped coordinate details, but the charges I carried had already narrowed that story to nothing. I laid the statements beside the timeline and named the stemware deposit, the linen rental, the test kitchen purchases, and the payments tied back to her, and every line connected the same way. What broke them was not my tone, because I never raised it, but the fact that each paper answered the last one before either of them could dress it up. Derek finally looked at Felicity and reached for the version that had almost worked before, calling it a private misunderstanding that had gotten personal too fast. She did not rescue him, and when she spoke, her voice stayed level enough to make every word land harder. Because what happened at your loft was not hospitality. Derek. It was unpaid infrastructure, wearing a wedding ring. Nobody argued after that. Not June. Not Alana. Not even Cassie. And I stood there looking at that beautiful table until I understood the sharpest part of the evening was not watching them lose the room, but feeling absolutely no desire to save it for them. After that tasting night, the room did what clean evidence always forces a room to do, which was step back from Derek without giving him one more story to hide inside. Felicity did not call to revisit his embarrassment. June did not need to update me on Cassie. And Ivy kept the next steps narrow, practical, and harder than anger. The timeline, the charges, the calendar entry, and Cassie's note had already finished the loud part. So what came next belonged to paper, signatures, deadlines, and distance. I moved into a smaller apartment in Capitol Hill with morning light across the front room and enough quiet to hear my own routines before anybody else's demands touched them. The first box I opened held my personal photographs, and I stood there sliding each print free without flinching, once at the sound of my phone on the counter. What changed me was not the new address by itself, but the fact that every object I unpacked belonged to a life that no longer required usefulness as payment for love. Ivy handled disclosures with the same dry precision she had used from that first phone call, and that steadiness mattered more to me than comfort would have. Derek could not move money the way he had before, could not blur business and marriage once the statements were attached to dates, and could not sell Cassie as harmless logistics anymore. When the stemware deposit, linen rentals, test kitchen charges, and shared card activities sat in one sequence, their little venture stopped looking stylish and started looking exactly what it was. I stopped measuring recovery by whether Derek looked diminished and started measuring it by smaller proofs my body recognized before my mind had language for them. I could set my phone down without feeling my chest tighten, cook one plate of pasta without bracing for commentary, and sleep through the night without rehearsing somebody else's priorities. The documents had done more than expose them, because once I watched those records hold under pressure, I stopped doubting my own memory every time tension entered a room. A week later, June came by carrying a plant wrapped in grocery paper, and Ivy arrived not long after, with sparkling water and that tired expression honest work leaves behind. I made dinner at my own table. Simple food. Warm bread, roasted vegetables, chicken with lemon, and nobody treated the meal like a performance I was expected to sustain. They sat with me, not across from a service being provided, and the quiet around that dinner felt nothing like the silence I used to mistake for peace. At one point, June touched the edge of her glass and murmured that the room fit me better. And because she had watched the spotless loft swallow Derek whole, I believed her immediately. Ivy looked toward the books stacked by the window and the photographs drying on the sideboard, then added that they had lost access while I had gained proportion. I did not answer right away, because the table itself had already said enough. One place setting for me first, one evening built without fear, and one home that did not turn me into infrastructure. I used to think peace meant keeping surfaces smooth, voices low, and dinners warm enough that nobody noticed what they were standing on or who had been flattened underneath it. Then Derek's texts, Cassie's note, June's voicemails, and those line item charges showed me that what I had been preserving was not love, but a system that kept shrinking me. I did not win because Derek lost a room, a donor circle, or the little business fantasy he tried to build behind my back, but because none of it could make me smaller again. Thank you for staying with me through this story and through the kind of silence so many women know before they finally hear themselves clearly. If any part of it felt close to home, I hope you find gentleness, steady love, and a life that does not ask you to disappear.